This unit of S244, Field Observer and Fire Effects Monitor, presents a short lesson on the role of policy and planning in monitoring fire. We'll see how management objectives can focus the monitoring efforts and make it more efficient. Upon completion of this unit, students will be able to describe the elements of monitoring required by the Interagency Prescribed Fire Implementation Guide, describe the rationale for monitoring on a wildfire, describe the relationship between goals and strategic objectives for management plans and the project objectives, and describe the relationship between management objectives and monitoring protocols. These objectives are directly related to tasks 6, 11, and 15 in the Fire Effects Monitor and Field Observer Position Taskbook. Policy and planning can be a dry subject, and we know what you're thinking. But if you'll bear with us, we'll offer you 2 incentives for your time. First, we'll make this unit as mercifully concise as possible, about 25 minutes. After all, this unit is all about being efficient. And if you make the effort to understand how policy and planning determine the monitoring required, you'll be able to focus only on what is required and decrease the amount of time and effort needed for effective monitoring. Understanding the concepts in this unit will reduce your monitoring workload. How's this going to work? One of the most common stumbling blocks in monitoring is over-monitoring. We often take many more measurements and more complicated measurements than are required, and the data are never used because they don't meet a defined need. The best way to avoid over-monitoring and reduce the amount of time and effort in monitoring is to limit the monitoring to only what is required. To understand this, we have to be familiar with what is required by policy and how this is further refined by management plans. We'll start with a policy document you should all be familiar with, the Interagency Prescribed Fire Planning and Implementation Procedures Guide. Whew, that's a mouthful. Can we just agree to call it the Prescribed Fire Guide for the rest of this unit? Good. The Prescribed Fire Guide contains the required planning elements for all prescribed fire projects implemented by federal land management agencies, including a template to be used for all prescribed fire plans. Element 20 of the Prescribed Fire Plan template describes the monitoring that is required for all prescribed fires. It reads, "Prescribed fire monitoring is defined as the collection and analysis of repeated observations or measurements to evaluate changes in condition and progress toward meeting a management objective. Describe the monitoring that will be required to ensure that prescribed fire plan objectives are met. For the prescribed fire, at a minimum, specify the weather, forecast and observed, fire behavior and fuels information, and smoke dispersal monitoring required during all phases of the project, and the procedures for acquiring it, including who and when." Notice that this element defines monitoring as observations or measurements to evaluate progress toward meeting a management objective, and directs us to describe the monitoring that will be required to ensure that prescribed fire plan objectives are met. This helps us to focus our observations and measurements on those that directly relate to the management objectives, rather than measuring every attribute of the project area. Gathering more information than is required is expensive and time-consuming, and the information is unlikely to be used if it doesn't address a specific management need. So, according to policy, the prescribed fire plan should specify the monitoring required for the project in Element 20. However, not all plans will give you enough detailed information to clearly indicate what and how to monitor. If the plan is not specific enough, go to the objectives in the plan, Element 5. Think about the fire behavior, smoke, and fire effects monitoring required to determine whether these objectives have been met. The interagency policies for monitoring on wildfires are not as clearly defined as they are in the Prescribed Fire Guide, but by looking at some of the components of the Wildfire Management Policy, we can infer the rationale for monitoring on wildfires and determine what will meet the management intent. The federal fire policy underwent significant modifications in 2008 and early 2009. As a result, in February of 2009, the National Wildfire Coordinating Group issued Guidance for Implementation of Federal Wildland Fire Management Policy. How about we just call it the guidance document? The guidance document contains many guidelines and explanations to describe the intent of the modifications and to clarify how the policy should be implemented. Among these guiding statements, The following passages emphasize the importance of well-defined management objectives and acceptable fire conditions in wildfire decision-making. A wildland fire may be concurrently managed for one or more objectives, and objectives can change as the fire spreads across the landscape. Objectives are affected by changes in fuels, weather, topography, and involvement of other governmental jurisdictions having different missions and objectives. Management response to a wildland fire on federal land is based on objectives established in the applicable Land or Resource Management Plan and/or the Fire Management Plan. Response to wildland fires is based on ecological, social, and legal consequences of the fire, the circumstances under which a fire occurs, and the likely consequences on firefighter and public safety and welfare. Natural and cultural resources, and values to be protected dictate the appropriate response to the fire. Land or resource management plans and/or fire management plans will address the location and conditions under which resource benefits and protection objectives can be met. Can you see how your observations of the fire and its environment fit into these guidelines? These statements imply that the management response to wildfire is determined by the consequences or effects of the fire in light of the management objectives. Therefore, monitoring of fire conditions and fire effects is critical to determining the appropriate management response to a wildfire. The timely observations of fire effects monitors and field observers help fire managers continually evaluate which strategies and tactics to use in managing a wildfire to best meet the management objectives. In addition to interagency policy, each of the federal land management agencies has fire monitoring policies specific to the agency, intended to ensure that the agency acquires the information its managers need to make fire management decisions. You should be familiar with your agency's fire monitoring policy, but know that in all cases the agency policies consistently require that monitoring is performed to determine whether management objectives were successfully met. For monitoring projects on state or non-government land, you will need to refer to local guidance documents to determine their monitoring policy. Agency-specific monitoring policies are found in the documents shown on this slide. In summarizing the impact of policy on monitoring activities, policies require us to determine whether our management objectives are being met. By definition, monitoring is what we do to evaluate management's progress toward meeting objectives. So policy directs us specifically to the management objectives to determine the required monitoring, and we can focus our monitoring on collecting the information that will be used to determine if these objectives have been met. In the next sections, we'll take a look at how the planning process creates management objectives and how we can use them to focus our monitoring efforts. Public land management programs are driven by the planning process, which involves land managers, interdisciplinary subject matter experts, and the public in defining the desired future conditions, preferred management outcomes, and appropriate uses of public lands. The products of the planning process are land use plans containing goals and management objectives that provide general guidance and direction for land and resource management activities for an administrative area, such as a national park, a recreation area, an Indian reservation, a national forest, or a wildlife refuge. Each of the federal land management agencies uses different terminology to refer to its land or resource management plan. The agency's specific names for this document are shown here. The states follow a similar procedure, but may have different names for their planning documents. In the first tier of the planning process, the Land or Resource Management Plan defines the goals for managing the administrative area. From the goals in the Land or Resource Management Plan, individual programs, such as fire management, formulate subordinate goals and strategic objectives based on the goals from the Land or Resource Management Plan and use them as a basis for a fire management plan that will spell out how fire management will contribute to the attainment of the overall land management goals. Based on the goals and strategic objectives of the fire management plan, the project plan, either the prescribed fire plan for prescribed fires or the Wildland Fire Decision Support System decision for wildfires, spells out specific and detailed project objectives for prescribed fire implementation and wildfire response. We've simplified this process for clarity. In reality, the lines between goals and strategic objectives are not so clear-cut. For instance, in some U.S. Forest Service units, the Fire Management Plan is not considered a NEPA-approved document. So the Land or Resource Management Plan provides the strategic objectives that the project objectives are based on. In the other agencies, some strategic objectives may also be found in the Land or Resource Management Plan, in addition to the land management goals. Understanding objectives is important because objectives represent a critical component of all land management programs and are the single most important factor driving all management actions, and objectives are what you will focus on as a fire effects monitor or field observer. So let's dig a little deeper into defining goals and the different levels of management objectives, and then see how the planning process plays out in real-life examples from federal land management areas. Goals are defined within land management as the desired state or target condition that a resource management policy or program is designed to achieve. Goals can be thought of as a desired future condition. A goal is usually not quantifiable and may not have a specific due date. Remember, goals are found in the Land or Resource Management Plan, and they form the basis from which objectives are developed. Objectives are tiered to goals and provide the bridge between goals and implementation. They are specific results to be achieved within a stated time period. They're narrower in scope and shorter in range than goals, and have an increased possibility of attainment. An objective specifies the time period for completion and defines measurable, quantifiable outputs or achievements. Here's where it starts to get complicated, but hang on and we'll get to some examples that will help clear things up. For our purposes in fire management, objectives can be further divided into strategic objectives and project objectives. Strategic objectives are higher-level objectives that define intended outcomes of management activities that will contribute to the maintenance or achievement of goals. They can be found in the overarching Land or Resource Management Plan with the goals, or in the subordinate programmatic plans like the Fire Management Plan. In some plans, strategic objectives are also called resource objectives. The easiest way to understand strategic objectives is to remember that they are the specific direction found in management plans that govern an entire organizational unit, such as a forest or a wildlife refuge. Project objectives, on the other hand, are found in documents that govern a single project, such as a prescribed fire unit or a wildfire incident. Project objectives are derived from the strategic objectives in the management plans. These are the most detailed objectives, and correctly written project objectives will be specific to the project, measurable in quantifiable terms, and achievable within a designated time period. We're going to discuss 4 types of project objectives. Treatment objectives and treatment constraints are found in the prescribed fire plan for an individual prescribed fire project. The incident objectives and incident requirements are found in the Wildland Fire Decision Support System decision that is used to manage wildfire incidents. They are usually repeated in the daily incident action plan. The objectives from both the prescribed fire plan and the Wildland Fire Decision Support System decision describe what the fire managers are trying to achieve on a specific fire, whether a prescribed fire or a wildfire. Both the terms constraint and requirement mean essentially the same thing. They describe something we want to avoid doing, or a rule that should be followed. For instance, managing a prescribed burn to limit the amount of smoke produced is a common prescribed fire treatment constraint. Specifying objectives and constraints or requirements is a matter of declaring what management of the fire should accomplish and what it should avoid. All 4 of these terms refer to project objectives, so why create 2 different categories for each type of fire? One reason is that it helps demonstrate an awareness of both the beneficial and the undesirable aspects of fire, and it ensures that all potential effects of the fire are considered in decision-making. It also helps to ensure that when fire is used to achieve one management objective, it doesn't inadvertently have a negative impact on a related objective if it can be avoided. These 4 types of objectives are the most important ones for fire effects monitors and field observers to understand on every fire assignment. If the difference between the 4 types of project objectives seems a little fuzzy right now, don't worry. It's more important that you're familiar with the terms and can locate them in the project plan. So what happened to the term management objective that we originally set out to define in this section? While each of the terms described in this graphic has a specific tiered relationship to the others, the term management objectives is often used as a generic term for any or all of the more specific terms. When you run across the term management objectives, Know that it can be used to refer to any one of the levels of goals and objectives we've discussed here, or it might be used to cover all of the goals and objectives collectively. Now that we've got that straightened out, let's look at how this plays out on the ground by using examples from some real fire projects on federal land. We'll look at the planning process for prescribed fire using a burn project at the Florida Panther Refuge. The Comprehensive Conservation Plan for the Panther Refuge has as one of its goals provide optimum habitat conditions for the Florida panther. The Panther Refuge Fire Management Plan then defines how fire management will contribute to attaining this goal. Because deer are a critical prey species for the panther, the Fire Management Plan supports that goal by incorporating the strategic objective enhance deer forage using prescribed fire to create a mosaic pattern of burn severity on 6,000 acres annually. When the fuels staff at the Panther Refuge writes a prescribed fire plan for the Eastern Fire Management Unit, they refer to this strategic objective and create a treatment objective to consume 40 to 80% of understory vegetation within wet prairie and pine habitat during each treatment. During the biological assessment of the plan, the refuge biologist affirmed that this treatment objective will contribute, along with other prescribed fire projects, to success in meeting the strategic objective and the overall goal. The treatment constraint of keep flame lengths less than 10 feet to limit overstory mortality is a requirement defined by the refuge biologist that also supports the overall goal of panther habitat conservation. Its inclusion here is critical to ensuring that this aspect of the goal is also considered in formulating the treatment prescription. It's possible to be successful in addressing both treatment objectives and treatment constraints, but only if the limiting constraints are identified and clearly spelled out in the prescribed fire plan. Now let's look at an example of the wildfire planning process from the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming. The Forest Management Plan for the Shoshone Forest includes as one of its goals both unplanned ignitions and prescribed fire are used as tools to achieve and maintain vegetation conditions and desired fuel levels. That goal is supported by the Shoshone National Forest Fire Management Plan, which defines how fire management on the Shoshone will contribute to attaining this goal by incorporating the strategic objective, reduce the accumulation of natural fuels resulting from insect epidemics and lack of fire in the past 100+ years. When the fire management staff on the Shoshone evaluates an unplanned ignition named the Castle Fire, they produce a Wildland Fire Decision Support System decision incorporating this strategic objective. Then, they create an incident objective to allow fire to consume heavy loading of dead and down 100-hour and 1,000-hour fuels by 30 to 60%. Achieving this project objective will contribute, along with other wildfires and prescribed fire projects, to success in meeting the strategic objective and the overall goal. The incident requirement of coordinate smoke management actions and reporting with Wyoming air quality regulators is related to a management requirement in the Fire Management Plan addressing air quality compliance. But its inclusion here is critical to ensuring that smoke management is considered in formulating the wildfire response. Again, it's important to identify and address related management objectives that must be considered when deciding the appropriate response to a wildfire. In each of these examples, we've simplified the situation for clarity. Normally, prescribed fires and wildfires must address multiple and sometimes conflicting objectives. Can you see how your duties as a fire effects monitor or field observer would provide critical information for fire managers as they try to balance multiple objectives and requirements? In a perfect world, you as a field observer or fire effects monitor would receive clear, detailed instruction from the burn boss, the situation unit leader, or the fire behavior specialists on what aspects of the fire to monitor and what methods to use, and you should always contact someone in one of these positions to ask for specific direction. At the very least, you must always ensure that you understand where your assignment is for the day, who you are to report to on the fire line, and how to perform your duties safely given the specific fire situation. However, the instructions on what you are to monitor and how are often less specific, and you might have to figure out some of this information from the burn plan or the incident action plan. So where do you start? Remember from the section on policy that monitoring is defined by the prescribed fire guide as the orderly collection, analysis, and interpretation of environmental data to evaluate management's progress toward meeting objectives and to identify changes in natural systems. So, by definition, monitoring is driven by objectives. By focusing on the key resources identified in the objectives from the project plan and determining what change is desired through the use of fire, you can determine which methods will help you measure and report progress in achieving these objectives. The methods that you use to measure and report fire effects are called protocols, which are an established set of detailed instructions to follow to correctly perform a specific measurement of an attribute, such as fuel loading or percent cover for a particular plant species. It's really just the instruction book for each monitoring method. In a later unit, we'll look at specific monitoring protocols and where to find them. But for now, you just need to know that the project objectives can help you choose the right protocol. For example, a prescribed fire treatment objective of consume 60 to 90% of 1-hour fuels during each treatment tells you the resource of interest to measure, in this case, 1-hour fuel loading, and what aspect of the resource should be measured, percent consumption in this example. In a later unit, we'll discuss the protocol known as Brown's Transects that can be used to measure fuel loading and consumption. Simply put, a monitoring protocol can be chosen by looking at the project objectives and asking yourself, what would I measure to tell me whether we met this objective? Fire effects are certainly not the only observations you will be tasked with on a fire assignment. Fire effects monitors and field observers are assigned to make a wide range of observations in support of fire behavior prediction, safety, and operational planning, including information on fuels, topography, weather, fire behavior, smoke, and fire location. Fire management is objective-driven, and each of these pieces of information is a critical component used by other members of the fire management organization to determine how to most effectively meet the management objectives for the fire. For instance, one of your most important tasks is to gather fire behavior observations to assist fire behavior specialists in verifying and calibrating their predictions. Accurate fire behavior predictions are essential to firefighter and public safety, structure protection, and use of fire for resource benefit, all of which are common fire management objectives. When you understand what fire managers are trying to achieve and what they are trying to avoid through the management of fire, you can anticipate the information they'll want and tailor it to their needs. You can also eliminate collecting information that was not requested and does not address a management need. The remainder of this course will demonstrate specific methods of mapping and measuring environmental conditions, fire behavior, and fire effects that will allow you to collect and report on the wide range of information needed by fire managers to effectively meet the management objectives of the fire. In summary, we looked at how policies define the monitoring requirements. We saw how management plans provide goals and strategic objectives that lead to the 4 types of project objectives. We discussed how these project objectives can help determine which monitoring protocols will be used and which aspects of the fire are important to observe and report. By understanding these concepts, you can focus your monitoring efforts on observations tied to the management objectives and make fire monitoring more time and cost efficient. On any fire incident, prescribed fire or wildfire, managed for multiple objectives, the effects of the fire determine whether the objectives are being met. Fire effects monitors and field observers play a vital role in fire management decision-making by observing and communicating how successfully management objectives are being achieved and reporting other observations critical to safe and effective fire management. In an upcoming unit, we'll cover the forms, reports, and summaries that fire effects monitors and field observers use to communicate this information to fire managers. Next are a few comprehension check questions. Note that these questions are not graded. Select an answer for the question and click Submit to check your answer. Click Next to move to the next question, or Previous to review or redo a question.